Hello and welcome to the Discover History channel. We were inundated with messages and comments after our last video looking at the infantry during the English Civil War. So I've dusted off more little model soldiers, more toy soldiers as Helen would call them, and we're going to look at the cavalry. However, before we do that, we've had a few questions, and one question in particular was one from Andrew. Andrew was asking about the size of units during the English Civil War, and in reality, they were meant to stand at around about 700 strong. So your average pike and musket block, your average infantry unit set up in that battalion formation should be around about 700 strong. However, when we look at the statistics from that period and we look at primary sources, for example, we know for a fact that some regiments were much smaller than that, some being only about 300 to 500 strong, and very much like regiments are today in the modern British Army, the regiments were actually broken down into companies, but in theory about 700 strong. Before the English Civil War began, we have to remember there was no standing army for Great Britain at all. So we very much relied on what was called the trained bands, or the militias as they were called, really, which were very much like Dad's army. They were very much local troops that would very rarely serve outside the county. Saying that, some soldiers did sign up for service outside the county. Examples of that could be, for example, in the Bishops' Wars before the Civil War began, where several men from counties did actually sign up for what they termed as foreign service, service outside the county. We don't have a standing army in Britain for a very, very long time. These militias and trained bands were raised when the need was there. The biggest threat to Britain came in 1588, for example, during the Spanish Armada, and we raised the militias and trained bands for that particular threat. Straight after, they were dispersed. They went back to their normal day job, and that was what it was like really at the start of the English Civil War as well. Both sides, royalists and parliamentarians, relied on the militias and trained bands. We only get a standing army technically in 1645, when Sir Thomas Fairfax and also Oliver Cromwell formed what became known as the New Model Army, the newly modelled army. But we can do a separate video on that one later. So hopefully, Andrew, that's answered your question. If you think about how many were involved in battles, if we use the Battle of Worcester for an example, it is estimated that the Royalist army brought forward about 12,000 men to the Battle of Worcester, which is quite an amazing feat when you think the population of Worcester was around about 7,000. Oliver Cromwell had brought with him a field army to Worcester of about 28 to 30,000 men. So you can imagine that's a big battle, one of the biggest ones, in fact. And once again, we can do a video separate to that. It's interesting also to note about that one is Oliver Cromwell also had more troops scattered across the country. So if the king had won at the Battle of Worcester, he would have been hit by another army shortly after. So battles can be really big, but infantry-wise, about 700 men strong on average, really. So now we turn our attention to the cavalry, and I've got, as Helen would say, my toy soldiers here. And the cavalry, also referred to as the horse, whereas the infantry were generally known as the foot, were broken down into three types, really. Just like the infantry had pikemen and musketeers, there was technically three types of cavalry. So we'll pan down, and what we have is the first type is, if we look at the man on the white horse here, is actually known as harquebusiers, or light cavalry. So these would have been your bog standard cavalry at the time, wearing the tri-bar pot, sometimes referred to as the lobster tail helmet, back in breastplate, sometimes with a buff coat underneath, sometimes with just a buff coat. And he is riding on a horse, which is his main weapon as well as mode of transport. You will notice just next to the saddle there are two pistol holsters. Every cavalry trooper was supposed to have two flintlock pistols or wheel lock earlier in the early days, which would have been discharged in battle. He is also armed with the sword, a very long, sharp sword used for slashing at the opponent's either enemy horses, enemy riders, or at the infantry on the ground. What you can't see is the fact he would also have clipped to himself on a strap would have been a carbine as well, which was a short version of a musket, which was predominantly used by the cavalry. They could also be wheel lock, actually, some of those, but predominantly flintlock was taking over. So that is our harquebusier. The next figure that we have on the brown horse is actually one of the old style cavalry units, and they were often referred to as cuirassiers, and these were the heavy cavalry of the Civil War. By 1642 and 1643, these were very much out of date, and really they slowly disappear from the battlefield. One of the most famous regiments of cuirassiers has to be Sir Arthur Heselrigg, who formed a cavalry unit predominantly made of cuirassiers, and they were always nicknamed by other soldiers as Heselrigg's lobsters, because they were very much like lobsters, head to foot in armour. I say head to foot. The cuirassier armour technically started with the helmet, the helm, and ended at the knee. The lower parts of the legs, like most cavalry, are protected by the thick bucket top boots. Once again, armaments, they have pistols and predominantly a sword. Some even carried a battle axe, a war axe, or war hammer, used as a tin opener of the day, really. So the cuirassier, very rarely used in the Civil War. They were going out of use mainly because the firearm was taken over. And then finally, the man on foot, which looks unusual when I'm talking about the cavalry, is actually what was known as a dragoon. A dragoon was nothing more than a mounted man, a mounted foot soldier. They were musketeers in battle, but they rode a horse to get from A to B. We did used to think years ago that they would have worn bucket top boots and very much dressed like the cavalry. However, more modern research shows that they would have been dressed as a musketeer. Bucket top boots are a nightmare to run in. I've tried it. Shoes is much better, and we know some did actually wear spurs onto their shoes. The interesting thing is they were meant to have flintlock muskets as well. However, most of them we know from the accounts were still using matchlocks as well. We know they were very useful troops. If you want a job done quickly, you want to move troops around, you can send a detachment of dragoons down there. They would dismount and they would fight on foot, more as a skirmishing role more than anything. Dragoons could also be used to protect baggage trains, and they were used for foraging, going out and finding food for the rest of the army. So our little man here is dismounted, fighting on foot. So that's the dragoons. But if I remove him from the table, what we have is a detachment of harquebusiers. They would have been formed up very much like the infantry, whereas the infantry was broken down into companies. They were broken down into what was called a troop, and they would have had an officer given the orders and commanding the troops, and we would have also had what was known as a cornet of horse. A cornet of horse would have carried a smaller flag and acted like the ensign within an infantry regiment. But how did their tactics differ from the infantry? Well, usually they would be formed up in long lines. Cavalry were meant to fight very close together, so these are quite wide apart. Some accounts refer to them being bucket top boot against bucket top boot, very much close together. And there was a change in cavalry tactics by the time the Civil War began in 1642. The original idea would be the cavalry would never gallop at top speed. They would lose control of the formation. They would go at high speed but not at the full gallop, and they would come forward and discharge their pistols. They could also discharge their carbines as well, and the old tactic would be then to turn and actually gallop out of the way. They could then return to the rear, and then the next line could then appear, charging forward and discharging their pistols and then withdrawing to the rear. So that was a very firearm focused way of fighting, using the firearms, discharging them and turning around. Very much the same tactic as the infantry when it came to musketeers, firing in line. However, there was a new tactic being trialled, and one of the greatest people to use this tactic was actually Prince Rupert. And Prince Rupert was starting to realise that this tactic was quite a pointless one because you weren't really gaining any ground. So Prince Rupert, he wasn't the only one, but Prince Rupert was quite into charging his men forward as a body, not at top speed, not at the gallop, but at a speed that could be controlled, discharging the pistols, discharging the carbines, and then instead of withdrawing, continuing the attack, but this time with swords drawn. Therefore, the swords become the predominant weapon. The next line will come forward very much in the same way, discharging pistols and carbines, and then finishing off with the sword. The only problem about this tactic was the fact that it was very, very difficult to control. And as we all know from some of the famous battles like Naseby, the cavalry had a tendency to disappear off the battlefield and never to be seen again. So hopefully that's given you a bit of an introduction to how the cavalry fought in the English Civil War. If you want, we could look at the artillery next if you want to. The choice is really yours. As we keep saying, this is as much your channel as it is ours. If you want us to do anything in particular, we're very happy to do it. My specialism really is military history, so I can bring some weapons to demonstrate with, some armour to show you, some tactics like we've been doing with the infantry and the cavalry, but I'm happy to look at social history as well, just like Helen is quite happy to do some more cookery or start looking at some other topics. The choice is really yours. So as we always say, stay safe and see you soon. Bye bye.